More recently, using modern climate change models, scientists have looked back at that work and found that many fewer nuclear weapons could cause that long-lasting nuclear winter effects than had been imagined back in the 1980s.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. My guest today, Zia Mian, is co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security. He's a physicist who has long studied nuclear weapons and nuclear security. In our conversation, Zia Mian explains how scientists have impacted policy discussions about nuclear weapons since the dawn of the nuclear age, and how as the nuclear security landscape is evolving and as science is advancing, scientists can continue to contribute to our understanding of the effects of a nuclear war. In addition to his perch at Princeton, Zia Mian serves as co-chair of the Scientific Advisory Group of the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is the first international scientific body created by a UN treaty process for the purpose of advancing nuclear disarmament, and in our conversation, he explains how the work of scientists can contribute to a nuclear-free world. We kick off, however, discussing the recent conflict between India and Pakistan and what this conflict says about the role of nuclear weapons in international security today. We recorded this conversation in conjunction with the Carnegie International Nuclear Policy Conference. To view other episodes in this series, please visit globaldispatches.org. Now here is my conversation with Zia Mian of Princeton University. Well, Zia, thank you so much for joining me today. I wanted to spend the bulk of our conversation talking about how science and scientists like you can help achieve a nuclear-free world, what it would take. But before we get there, I am kind of curious to learn your perspective on the recent conflict between India and Pakistan. We are speaking about a week after a ceasefire was reached between these two nuclear-armed powers, after a period of really intense escalation between the two. What do we know thus far, if anything, about the role that nuclear weapons might have played in this conflict, in setting the parameters of this conflict?
The India-Pakistan conflict, in its most recent phase, needs to be seen in the context both of previous conflicts between Pakistan and India, including before both countries had nuclear weapons, and how things have both remained familiar but also have changed in some ways since both of them acquired nuclear weapons, but also in the context of the fact that other nuclear-armed states are also engaged in violent conflicts at the present time. And it raises the larger question about the role of nuclear weapons and of nuclear-armed states in today's world and their propensity to engage in war and warlike activities, and not treat any one of these cases as isolated from either of its particular historical context or of the larger context of nuclear-armed states and how they use their nuclear weapons or not in particular ways at particular moments in our world. So looking at the India-Pakistan situation, many reports of the most recent episode of fighting have focused on the sense that this has been a major escalation in comparison to the fighting that has taken place between them in 2019 when there was a major military incident where Indian jet fighters crossed into Pakistan and attacked targets, and Pakistan shot down an Indian jet fighter and captured the pilot, and previous conflicts going back to 1999, the year after both India and Pakistan did nuclear weapon tests. And there was the Kargil War in Kashmir, and both sides engaged in intense fighting. And there was the use of jet fighters in that conflict also. But in the present, most recent conflict, the number and scale and scope of the attacks that both sides launched against each other have led some people to say that this is far beyond the kinds of actions that they've taken in the last 25 years and have harked back to the 1971 India-Pakistan war that led to the independence of Bangladesh. But one of the things that one has to keep in mind is that throughout the history of India-Pakistan wars, going all the way back to the war that began soon after the partition of British India that led to their emergence as independent nation states, there has never been the practice of the large-scale attacks on urban populations that is characteristic of other kinds of wars in other kinds of situations. And so when you think about the fact that India attacked targets in various Pakistani cities and Pakistan attacked various sites in India, nothing in any of their history of fighting each other bears comparison to the level and intensity of violence, for example, that Israel has unleashed in Gaza or that Russia has unleashed in Ukraine. And so we need to keep in mind that all of their wars against each other have been marked by a kind of restraint that is worth keeping in mind.
Well, I have seen it proffered in various, analysts and media sources and experts who, have made the argument that precisely because India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons, that despite the fact that this was far more intense than previous fighting, and despite the fact that urban population centers were targeted, it did not escalate further precisely because both countries have nuclear weapons.
That argument is often made, and that argument proceeds with a kind of decontextualized nuclear logic, which doesn't pay attention to the fact that the pattern of Indian-Pakistani military conflict is not like the pattern of military conflicts of Western European states or the United States of America or Russia in their wars. American nuclear strategy, European nuclear strategy, Soviet and Russian nuclear strategy was profoundly shaped by the large-scale strategic bombing campaigns of World War II, with a massive indiscriminate destruction of cities in the attempt to try and destroy the capacity of your adversary to make war. And the resort to nuclear weapons was part and parcel of taking that form of war making to a level of efficiency in terms of the number of airplanes and the destruction that could be caused, etc., but not a fundamental strategic shift. The nuclear weapons were supposed to do more of what strategic bombing had done, but to do it in a more efficient and effective way. India and Pakistan do not have a history of that kind of strategic war making with the attempt to destroy the capacity of their adversary to make war. So the attacks on industry, the attacks on urban populations, the attacks on infrastructure that have been characteristic of World War II style military planning that lies at the heart of nuclear strategy is not part and parcel of their practice. And so the notion that they would escalate to that kind of war making assumes that suddenly having nuclear weapons changes their entire concept of war.
That's interesting. And, at least to me, the fact that these two nuclear armed powers went to war in the manner in which they did just suggests to me an overarching need for something I know you have been working on for a long time, the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I know you're central to that effort, and that you sit on the scientific advisory committee advising that treaty process and the TPNW effort. So before we kind of get into the role of science here, can you just explain, what does the TPNW seek to do?
So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons marked the culmination of a many decades long effort by non-nuclear weapon states to create new conditions for the global debate about the elimination of nuclear weapons. The very first resolution ever passed by the General Assembly of the United Nations in January 1946, Resolution 1, called for a plan for the elimination of nuclear weapons. This was the first business that the United Nations, as the new body for organizing the international community after World War II, took upon itself. And both the United States and the Soviet Union submitted plans for the elimination of nuclear weapons, but they were fundamentally incompatible and neither side was willing to compromise. But the effort by non-weapon states ever since to try and find a path to nuclear disarmament, despite the unwillingness of nuclear-armed states to take action on this, been a constant thread of international nuclear politics. It hasn't attracted the same kind of attention as the history and practices and politics of the nuclear-armed states in their relationships with each other. So many people are far more familiar with US-Soviet arms control history and the history of the threats of use of nuclear weapons and the wars involving nuclear weapon states, mostly against states without nuclear weapons, but sometimes proxy wars against each other, and not as familiar with the tireless efforts of non-weapon states and civil society groups around the world to make progress on nuclear disarmament. And so what a highlight came actually 70 years ago when in 1955, the newly independent countries from European colonial empires had the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, which led to the creation of the non-aligned movement. And one of the key statements in that 1955 meeting, where more than 24 newly independent countries got together and said, look, we cannot accept that the only choice for the world is the Cold War standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union and the endless risk of global thermonuclear war, killing all of us because we, as newly independent countries, would be innocent bystanders in this global war. So the idea of the non-aligned movement was that they wanted and they called for a ban on the threat of nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons, and progress towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. And so over and over again, states have tried to make efforts, and written into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that was agreed in 1968, entered into force in 1970, was Article 6, the disarmament article of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which non-weapon states were instrumental in having added to the treaty. The US and the Soviet Union didn't include that article in their original versions of the treaty. And what that article says is that every state party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, every state's party, has an obligation to undertake negotiations in good faith to end the arms race at an early date, to achieve nuclear disarmament, and so on. And often this article has been interpreted that nuclear-armed states in the treaty, the United States, Soviet Union, now Russia, Britain, France, and China, have an obligation to end the arms race and achieve nuclear disarmament because they have nuclear weapons. But the treaty actually very explicitly says every state. And so what's happened is the fact that the vast majority of states in the world, about 193, do not have nuclear weapons and do not rely on nuclear weapons and do not expect nuclear weapons to be used in their defense. There are only 9 countries with nuclear weapons and 183 without nuclear weapons. And so the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons comes as an effort by the non-weapon state signatories of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to implement their obligation to take action to end the arms race and move forward on nuclear disarmament. And so after many years of trying to redirect the conversation about nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament away from nuclear strategy and arms control, counting of how many weapons are enough at any particular point, leading to the ever slower reduction of the number of nuclear weapons held by the United States and Russia. After the Cold War, non-weapon states pushed harder and harder for progress, and they tried to begin a conversation about not nuclear weapons as sources of national security, but to focus on nuclear weapons as sources of catastrophic humanitarian harm. And through a series of ever larger international conferences focused on the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, and the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons is what is in fact threatened by nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence, the politics of the threat of use of nuclear weapons as part of coercion against adversaries, which is the hallmark of the 9 nuclear armed states, is that we will threaten catastrophic damage. And so by focusing on the humanitarian consequences and international law about the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, an ever larger coalition of non-weapon states were able to find a common language and a common perspective on how to move in a new way towards creating a new legal instrument for nuclear disarmament. And the need for a new legal instrument came from the 1996 judgment by the International Court of Justice, the World Court, when it was asked whether the threat and use of nuclear weapons was illegal under international law. And the court said the threat and use of nuclear weapons is basically illegal under almost any conceivable circumstances. And even if any use of nuclear weapons were to take place, that it would have to be under the conditions under which that use would be consistent with international humanitarian law.
What I find, I think, so refreshing about the TPNW is just as you described, it helps change the conversation around nuclear weapons away from like strategic arms limitation agreements and towards a more comprehensive vision of a nuclear-free world. Essentially, though, this is an act of politics to get there. But you, as a scientist in the scientific community, I know, has an important role to play here. So what can and how does science and scientists help advance this cause? And what are you doing on the advisory committee to the TPMW to move towards that end of a nuclear-free world?
I mean, science has been central to the effort to understand and highlight the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons from the very beginning. And it's often forgotten that even before the first ever atomic bomb was built, before the Manhattan Project was even launched, the physicists that first had the idea that nuclear weapons might even be possible back in 1940, for example, were already warning about nuclear fallout, for example, and the indiscriminate destruction that nuclear weapons would cause on cities. And they, at that time, warned that any use of nuclear weapons would lead to fallout that would be carried by the wind and therefore cause harm far away from any target and would almost certainly lead to harm and death to civilian populations. And so over and over again, scientists have come back to this. I mentioned that this is the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. It's also the 70th anniversary of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which was the last political act by Albert Einstein before his death, where he and Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, issued a public statement calling for scientists to gather in conference to help everybody understand the threat of thermonuclear weapons, in particular hydrogen bombs that had just been developed and tested by the United States. And they highlighted in that manifesto, as it came to be called, the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear war and the use of nuclear weapons. So over and over again, each generation of scientists throughout the nuclear age, there have been voices from the scientific community highlighting this terrible, terrible damage. And kind of fast forwarding to where we are now, in the 1980s, Carl Sagan and other US scientists and Soviet scientists also developed the idea of nuclear winter, the fact that nuclear war may set cities on fire and create such high levels of smoke and soot that would rise high into the atmosphere above the clouds, into the stratosphere, and therefore not be rained out and remain suspended for long periods of time, blocking sunlight and therefore causing a period of cold and dark across most of the Earth's surface and causing catastrophic collapse of agriculture and natural ecosystems that rely on sunlight, also destroying the ozone layer. And so more recently, using modern climate change models, scientists have looked back at that work and found that many fewer nuclear weapons could cause that long-lasting nuclear winter effects than had been imagined back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, people thought it would take all-out war between the United States and Soviet Union to cause nuclear winter. Modern models suggest that many, many fewer weapons, including a nuclear war on the scale of the kinds of arsenals that India and Pakistan possess, perhaps 150, 160, 200 weapons each or so, that even arsenals smaller than that would be enough to trigger a nuclear winter effect with catastrophic harm to almost everybody in the world. And so science has been constantly part of building that. And at the humanitarian conferences that led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, this kind of science was a key part of building the common sense understanding of what the threat of use of nuclear weapons actually means. And that's why we have now about half of all the countries in the world have signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And more of them are joining as time passes. And central to that is exactly this question. And that's why the treaty very categorically makes a point of having as an obligation not just that you can't possess nuclear weapons. It also says that you cannot, under any circumstances, use nuclear weapons or threaten to use nuclear weapons. So even the threat of use of nuclear weapons is forbidden under the treaty because that threat involves the threat to cause catastrophic humanitarian damage.
I'm fascinated by your description of the history of scientific contributions to the political debates on the use and possession of nuclear weapons. I'm curious, though, to learn from you as a scientist active in this field, what's on the cutting edge of scientific research right now that will help us even better understand the impact of nuclear weapons? What are you working on? What are your colleagues working on that you're particularly excited or interested to learn?
The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, one of the things that the countries of the treaty did, based on a proposal that was made by myself and some of my colleagues at Princeton in 2019, was to create a permanent scientific advisory process for the countries of the treaty. And they agreed to that suggestion, and the scientific advisory group of the treaty was established in 2023 by the states of the treaty. And this is the first scientific body created by an international treaty specifically for the purpose of advancing nuclear disarmament, ever. And there are 15 members of the group, and they're nominated by states. And I am one of the two co-chairs of the scientific advisory group. And in our first report to states, we laid out what we thought were the key scientific questions that states needed to think about and understand. And one of the things that we highlighted was the fact that despite the work of scientists over many years on explaining and seeking to understand the effects of the use of nuclear weapons, there were still large gaps in our knowledge. And we recommended that the states of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons consider asking for a United Nations study on the effects of nuclear war. The last such study had been done in the 1980s, and the world is a very different place. And in so many ways, our scientific tools are much more advanced in many, many ways. And we recommended that such a study would help create a new common perspective for all states and people everywhere about what is the best current understanding of the effects of nuclear war, and highlight what are some of the remaining open questions that we still don't understand.
Is that in process? Are you working on that study now?
So at the end of 2024, the General Assembly of the United Nations voted overwhelmingly to endorse this proposal. And so the UN has begun the process of creating an independent scientific panel for the study of nuclear war. And it will have 21 members. And it's going to look at not just the physical effects of nuclear weapons in terms of the physical destruction of cities and so on. It's also going to look at the effects on the environment. It's going to look at the effects on economies around the world. It's going to look at the effect on ecosystems around the world. It's going to look at the effects on food and food systems around the world. And it's going to look at both local impacts, regional impacts, and global impacts. It's going to look at short-term impacts and long-term impacts. And so this is going to be the most substantive global international study of our current understanding of nuclear war that has ever taken place. And at the same time, a few years ago, Congress asked the US National Academy of Sciences to do a review of the current science of nuclear winter, which is one of the effects that is expected from nuclear war. And that study has been underway for some time at the National Academy of Sciences. But the National Academy of Sciences has also released a study in 2023, which highlighted the fact that in the United States, the nuclear war models that the US Defense Department uses for its own military nuclear war planning purposes, these models are classified, but the National Academy was given classified briefings and were able to write about some of what they discovered in an unclassified form. So in that National Academy study of these nuclear war models, they report that the US nuclear war models are actually very inadequate, that they do not include many, many effects that one would expect them to include. And because the National Academy revealed the Defense Department has never asked its nuclear war modeling groups to model those other effects. But what happens to economy? What happens to food? What happens to society when nuclear war takes place? All the models seem to do is to actually look to see what gets blown up and when can soldiers go back into that zone where a nuclear weapon has been used. They do not include any of the larger scale, longer term, more complex effects that nuclear weapons use would absolutely inevitably entail. And so we now know that that is a gap even in the United States' own understanding of what nuclear war would actually mean. And so part of what our scientific advisory group has been doing is to highlight that even though we know a lot about nuclear war, there are a lot of questions about nuclear war that we need to understand properly so that both non-weapon states and nuclear armed states themselves and their populations can have an agreed reason and science-based foundation for a conversation about, is this really the kind of war making that we are willing to accept? And that the threat of that war making is acceptable. So I think that's part of the key purpose of this, is to lay the scientific base for a globally fair and informed conversation about what actually nuclear deterrence, the threat of use of nuclear weapons, is nuclear deterrence, and what happens when deterrence fails, because all nuclear war planners assume deterrence will fail. That's why you have nuclear war plans. And so we need to make sure that everybody understands what does science have to say about this. So our scientific advisory group has been focusing a lot of our attention on helping clarify what are some of the kinds of issues that everybody needs to begin to understand and what more we need to know about all of this so that everybody has this common basis. Some of the other things that we're looking at also is that nuclear weapon testing, especially back in the 1950s and the 1960s, where so many nuclear tests were not underground but above ground, had catastrophic consequences for the places where testing took place, as well as spreading radioactivity around large parts of the world. Many people will know about the crises that took place in the late 50s and the early 60s with thermonuclear weapon testing, where the radioactive contamination spread around the world and people discovered that there was radioactivity in babies' teeth because of nuclear radiation that was released by the tests getting into food chains and so on. So one of the things that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons emphasizes in its obligations is the need to assist the victims of nuclear weapon testing, because many of these were local communities in colonized and colonial territories. For example, in the Pacific Ocean or in Australia, Kazakhstan, other places, as well as the tests that took place within countries themselves, often impacted marginalized communities. So trying to understand what has been the impact of all of that nuclear testing on those communities and on the environment that was home to these communities. After so many decades, there continues to be contamination in those environments, and members of those communities that were impacted continue to suffer long-term harm from that nuclear testing in the past. So one of the things the Scientific Advisory Group has been doing is trying to help understand and explain what is the current state of knowledge of the levels of contamination from past nuclear testing, both on people and on local environments, and what does that mean in terms of assisting victims and of remediating the environmental damage that was done. And one of the things that has been discovered just last year, for example, in work that was done by one of my Princeton colleagues who is a member of the Scientific Advisory Group, was the reconstruction of the very first ever nuclear weapon test, the Trinity nuclear test in the United States in 1945, before the dropping of the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because it was a secret nuclear weapon test, nobody in New Mexico, which is where the test took place, was told that your government is about to carry out the first ever nuclear explosion. Don't go outside, don't drink the water, don't eat the food, take safety measures. No one was told. And so the cloud of radioactivity that was released by this first ever nuclear test actually spread contamination across large parts of the United States. And it's now possible using modern scientific computational tools to reconstruct that nuclear test and where that radiation cloud went and how much contamination actually was caused. And so we begin to lay the basis now for a better understanding of past nuclear harms that were done that continue to affect present day populations, because there are still families who were harmed by that very first nuclear test and have been seeking compensation from the United States government for decades and have not yet had their harms recognized and addressed. And so those concerns also, are there for other places where nuclear testing has taken place and where harms have been done, and where science can help bring forward evidence and analysis that can allow people who have been harmed by past nuclear weapon activities to have those harms understood, recognized, and to the extent possible addressed, as well as the harms done to the environment.
Well, this is all really fascinating, Zia, and I look forward to hopefully having you back on the show at some point when that big UN report you referenced earlier is released. It sounds like that will be a really impactful, potentially game-changing way of understanding the threat of the use of nuclear weapons in the world today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.